At the center of Times Square, there is a giant clock that counts something most people can barely understand. The U.S. national debt. Right now, it is around $38 trillion and still rising. That number is so big that the human brain almost stops caring. It feels abstract, too large to matter, just a number on a screen. But here is the strange part. The number itself is not the real danger. The real danger is what happens when the interest bill becomes so large that it starts affecting everything else. Because at that point, debt is no longer just a number in the background. It becomes the thing shaping the future. And once that happens, a country starts making very different decisions. So in this video, I want to show you something simple. Not just that the debt is big, but how governments actually deal with debt when it becomes too big to ignore. And once you understand this, you'll never look at money, inflation, or government spending the same way again. Let's start very simply. Imagine you have a credit card. You spend $1,000 on it. If the interest rate is high, you don't just owe the $1,000 back. You also owe extra every month just because the balance exists. That is debt in the simplest form. Now imagine that instead of one person, it's a whole country. That country borrows money by selling bonds. And a bond is basically an IOU. It says, "Give us money now, and we'll pay you back later with interest." That's all it is. A bond is a promise. And that promise matters because it helps the government spend more than it collects in taxes. That gap is called a deficit. And if deficits continue long enough, debt keeps piling up. So the debt clock doesn't move because of one bad year. It moves because the machine never really stops. You'll hear people say, a government should behave like a household. But that is only partly true. A household can cut back. You can stop buying things. You can cook at home. You can cancel subscriptions. You can move in with family. A government is different. A government has huge fixed obligations. It has to pay for Social Security, Medicare, military spending, interest on old debt, infrastructure, public services, and a lot of legal promises it cannot easily reverse. So if the debt becomes too large, the government cannot just say, "Let's spend less and fix it." In reality, that choice is much harder, because every major spending cut has a voter attached to it, and every tax increase has a voter attached to it too. That is why debt becomes such a political trap. Not because the math is invisible, but because the math collides with democracy. This is where the problem gets serious. If a government owes a huge amount of money, it has to keep paying interest on that debt. And if interest rates rise, the bill rises too. That means the government can end up spending more and more just to keep the old debt alive. Not to improve schools, not to build roads, not to pay soldiers, just to service the debt. That is the key idea. The debt itself is one problem, but the interest on the debt is the real pressure, because interest compounds, and compound interest is powerful. If you owe a little, it's manageable. If you owe a lot, it becomes a machine. A machine that keeps growing even if you do nothing. So now imagine this in the real world. Debt is already enormous. Spending is politically hard to cut. Tax increases are unpopular, and interest rates are rising. That is how a debt problem turns into a budget problem. And once it becomes a budget problem, governments have to choose how to deal with it. There are really only three ways. Let's go through them one by one. The first option is austerity. That means cutting spending, raising taxes, and trying to shrink the debt slowly. On paper, this sounds responsible. In real life, it is painful. If you cut too hard, people lose benefits. If you raise taxes too much, businesses slow down and people spend less. If you do both at the same time, the economy can weaken fast. And in a democracy, that is a hard sell. Imagine a politician standing on stage and saying, "We're going to raise your taxes and cut your benefits for the next 10 years so the debt gets smaller." That person is probably not getting elected. So austerity is possible, but it is politically extremely difficult. That is why governments rarely choose it in a pure form. The second option is default. That means the government simply refuses to pay. It says, "We are not honoring this debt." Now, this is rare for major reserve currency governments because the consequences are huge. Why? Because government bonds are not just random pieces of paper. They are the foundation of the financial system. Banks hold them. Pension funds hold them. Insurance companies hold them. Foreign governments hold them. They are treated as one of the safest assets in the world. So if the United States government defaulted, it would not just hurt bondholders. It would shake the entire global financial system. It would cause panic. It would destroy trust. And once trust in government debt breaks, a lot of things start to break with it. That is why outright default is almost never the preferred option for a country like the United States. So if austerity is too painful and default is too dangerous, what is left? This is the quiet option, the subtle one, the one people often don't notice right away. Instead of refusing to pay the debt, the government pays it back in dollars that are worth less than the dollars it borrowed. That is inflation. Here's the simplest way to think about it. If you borrow $100 today, and 10 years later you pay back $100, that sounds fair. But if those dollars now buy a lot less than they used to, then you did not really repay the same value. You repaid the number, not the purchasing power. And that matters a lot. Because inflation helps reduce the real burden of debt. It also hurts savers. If your cash is sitting in a bank account earning 2%, but real inflation is 5% or 6%, then your money is silently losing value. You still see the same balance, but that balance buys less every year. That is why inflation is so powerful. It is not always dramatic. It is usually slow. And slow is what makes it dangerous. This is not a new strategy. After World War II, the United States had a huge debt burden. The government did not pay it off quickly through taxes. It did not default either. Instead, it used a mix of low interest rates and inflation to reduce the debt burden over time. In simple terms, the debt stayed high in nominal terms, but the economy grew, and the value of the debt shrank relative to that growing economy. This is one reason countries can survive very high debt levels, not because the debt vanishes, but because inflation and growth reduce the size of the problem over time. This is one of the oldest tricks in sovereign finance, not because governments are evil, but because it is often the easiest politically. And that brings us to the modern version of the same problem. In a healthy world, the central bank raises interest rates when inflation gets too high. That is the basic tool. Higher rates slow borrowing. Higher rates cool the economy. Higher rates can bring inflation down. But there is a catch. If the debt is already huge, high rates also make the government's interest bill explode. So the central bank gets trapped between two problems. If rates are too high, the debt becomes harder to manage. If rates are too low, inflation can stay elevated. This is where people use the term fiscal dominance. That just means the size of the debt starts influencing how much freedom the central bank really has. In other words, The central bank may still look independent, but the debt starts to limit its choices, and that is a huge shift. Because once that happens, the money system is no longer just about fighting inflation. It is also about protecting the government's ability to keep borrowing. Now let's talk about something most people never think about. When new money enters the economy, it does not reach everyone equally. This matters a lot. Imagine the government or central bank injects new money into the system. Who gets it first? Usually, financial institutions. Banks, bond markets, large asset holders. That means the first people to feel the effect are not always everyday workers. The first things to move are often stocks, bonds, real estate, and financial assets. Later, the higher prices filter down into groceries, rent, gas, and daily life. This is why inflation can feel so unfair, because the people closest to the money creation process often benefit first, and the people furthest away often feel the pain last. This idea is closely related to what economists call the Cantillon effect. You don't need to memorize the name. Just remember the principle. Where money enters the economy matters. That's the part most people never see. Now we get to the part that affects ordinary people the most. If the government uses inflation to reduce the burden of debt, then savers lose purchasing power. That means if you keep your money in cash or in very low-yield savings, you are slowly falling behind. This is why people feel like everything is getting more expensive, because in a sense, it is. But the deeper issue is that the value of money itself changes over time. So the old advice, work hard, save money, keep it in the bank, and you'll be safe, does not always work the way it used to. In a high-inflation, high-debt world, saving in cash can become a losing strategy. That doesn't mean saving is bad. It means savings alone may not be enough. This is why many people move into assets. Things like productive businesses, property, equities, commodities, and other scarce assets, because those tend to keep up better when money is being diluted. So how does a government actually keep a huge debt burden under control without making a giant political spectacle? Usually through a mix of tools. Not one big dramatic move, a mix. The central bank can buy government bonds, which helps keep borrowing costs lower. Banks, insurers, and pension funds may be encouraged or required to hold government debt. Officials may prefer inflation that is high enough to reduce the debt burden, but not so high that it causes panic. And instead of fixing the problem fast, governments often stretch it out over years. That's the key. They usually do not solve the debt problem in one clean move. They manage it. They stretch it. They smooth it out. They hope time does the work. And most of the time, that's exactly what happens. So what does all this mean in real life? It means the debt clock is not just a number for economists to argue about. It is a sign of what kind of economy we are living in. It tells you why inflation matters, why interest rates matter, why bond markets matter, why cash is not always safe, and why governments care so much about trust. Because money is not just paper. Money is a system of trust. And when debt gets large enough, that trust becomes more fragile. Not instantly, not in a dramatic movie moment, but slowly, quietly, year after year. That is why the real crisis is often invisible while it is happening. People look for collapse. But what usually happens first is erosion. A little less purchasing power, a little more pressure on wages, a little more debt, a little less faith in the old rules. That is how systems change. So here is the simple version. The United States debt problem is not just about how much is owed. It is about how the government chooses to manage the burden. And the three main choices are: cut spending and raise taxes, default, or reduce the real value of the debt through inflation. For a country like the United States, the most likely path is usually the third one. Not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden default, but a slow, managed erosion of the debt in real terms. That is why the debt clock matters. Not because it predicts one giant crash, but because it shows the pressure building in the background. And once you understand that, you start seeing the rest of the system differently. You see why inflation is political, why interest rates are political, why central banks matter, and why the fight over money is really a fight over power. In the next video, we're going to break down the exact tools governments use to make debt feel smaller than it really is. Things like yield curve control, bond market manipulation, CPI calculations, and the hidden transfer of wealth that happens when money is created. Because once you understand the debt problem, you start to understand the whole system.